Welcome to the Shelburne Planning Commission on January 9th. First item on the agenda is approval of the agenda, which I am now looking for because I believe we need to make a modification. Would somebody mind moving to make an amendment?
Sure, I will move to make an amendment to the agenda.
Okay. And I think I just did the order wrong, but, okay. Yeah, I did. Well, let's review it then. Yes, we need to add a line item. It can be right in the beginning. I would say you can make it just after open to the public. Before we really get into it, to approve the telecom application, because our ordinance says that it has to be approved by the telecom board, which we are serving as, and to our knowledge that it has not previously been approved. So any objection to making that in between 5 and 6? No. All right. Okay, so then all in favor of the agenda with that modification, say aye.
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 Aye. All right. So then, moving on, we have the approval of the minutes from December 19th. Take a motion to approve those.
It's Tyler Scott, not Tyler Soot.
So moved by Stephen and seconded by, is that you, John?
I'll second it.
Okay, seconded by John. So the discussion, somewhere it says not Tyler Scott? I missed that.
Well, I read the ones that were on.
It's the second paragraph.
Second paragraph on the second page.
Yeah.
Ah,
Tyler
right.
Scoot, not
Yeah, it's just a
Soot.
typo.
Yeah.
It's spelled correctly elsewhere.
In the otherwise impeccable minutes.
Exactly, absolutely.
And I did not have any comments. Were there any other comments?
No, it was good.
All right. Really do look good. Okay, so all in favor of the minutes with that one correction? Aye?
Aye.
Okay.
Hi. Hey, Stephen, how are you?
Next, we have any disclosures relating to any potential conflicts of interest?
No.
All right.
Just mentioned use the sign-in sheet.
Oh, yes. And next is open to the public. And anybody who is here, if you wouldn't mind, signing in on the sign-in sheet, and then this.
Just put residents of the Martindale neighborhood. Sign something.
There you go. And then are there any comments related to anything not on the agenda this evening? Please. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey, Brian.
I'm Brian Precourt. A few months ago, I came to you regarding the request for the sidewalk, the ability to waive sidewalks. The board was going to look into a couple other things, or I haven't received anything back as far as answers or anything, so just trying to find out where that is.
Yeah, and there was some discussion on that. Trying to remember what we had raised this.
I think, Kate, were you going to talk to the Bikes and Paths Committee?
Right,
Did I make that up?
that was a few months ago.
Someone else?
Well, I think,
remember.
yeah, there was that you were going to raise it there. I raised it at a select board meeting, and there was general agreement, but I think it might just be a process type thing, because I know we were looking for input from them.
Yeah, there was a brief conversation at the PADS committee. There were comments offered by the housing subcommittee. It wasn't, I would call, a groundswell of agreement to make the change. And I think it was really a matter of, it's one of probably a dozen things that you've got as a possible bylaw change, and it didn't rise to the top compared to some of the other things that you've been working on. So it's got to come back up.
Yeah,
but-
thanks for saying that, actually, because I think, at least in the discussions that I had, or that I was a part of, the idea that had been floated of having a fund that could be contributed to, that the town could then use for sidewalk purposes, I think that did get some nods. I think that was at the select board meeting that I brought that up. And details are escaping me, but I think that kind of got sidelined because of all the budget discussions that are happening right now. So I unfortunately don't have any status to update on.
Yeah, and I think the PATS, I don't think I was able to attend that PATS committee meeting where this was discussed specifically, but in the past, there's been openness to the idea of having a fund so that we can, contribute, somebody could contribute, not be off the hook for having to pay their fair share, but there would be a way to prioritize where the infrastructure is most wanted at that time. So, but yeah, unfortunately that's going to require select board approval to set something like that up.
And I know that you have a timeline because you were talking.
No, I told
right?
the neighbors that they were opposed to it. I told the neighbors I'd come to the planning commission and see if it's something I could get done. If it can't get done, I've made my attempt. All somebody has to do is tell me, hey, it's not a high priority, we're not going to do it. If you ask a question, you want an answer. Answer doesn't always have to be yes, but you expect an answer. So
Agreed, and actually to recap.
If the answer's no, that's fine. I'll tell the neighbors, I came and it was no. So, but you expect an answer. So.
True, I appreciate that.
No, that's fine. I understand.
Right on.
Thanks.
For the benefit of the board, though.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. The two things that we were coming up against were, from our perspective, it would make sense if there could be a fund that could be contributed to in that case, because the alternative would be to have a waiver, and the way that waivers would be used, I think it was in the opinion of our discussion that would be the default, would be to go down the waiver path if something didn't kind of make sense, and that there was too much room for taking too much latitude down that path. And I think I think we're just stuck in a bit of a bureaucratic hole in terms of process. Maybe best thing would be I could raise this to the select board or have a direct conversation with Peter, I know we would ultimately we'd need to change the rules, but this was getting out of our purview in terms of having a fund that could be contributed to.
I think it was a bigger, more complicated question, and it had a more complicated answer. And so it wasn't in that set of things that you were going to take care of in this first slug of form-based zoning changes. Right. And that's where you are. You're still waiting for the select board to act on that. These things with the bowling alley property came about really because you had someone come on 2 different occasions and make a pitch, and you have decided that you want to have some internal discussion or discussion amongst yourselves, and they're going to be back. And so you're dealing with that, but you still haven't had this larger, more global discussion that I know Megan has said that I think would set the stage for the more complicated, not the things that you were just going to add to the Brandy Saxton edit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I viewed that as a separate initiative, but there are other inputs that are beyond what we can directly handle, outside of just modifying a waiver process and being incredibly specific, which it seems like it just complicates
Even if there's a consensus to do it through a waiver process, you're going to figure out, okay, what are the criteria, and then that's going to be built into whatever other changes you were going to make.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Then any other comments from the public not related to agenda items? Seeing none. All right. Then the modified agenda, we need to approve the telecommunications application.
Yes, to make it clear, the application form.
The form, right. Not a submitted application.
And I do have copies. If you all have it in your packets, right?
Yep.
Okay. And I know that there was at least one catch that Neil had made where the DRB was referenced from the old days.
The application form was online, it was electronic. That was in the packet.
Oh, okay, well, that's, right. So here you do have paper copies. That's my apology.
Sorry, it was in the same thread as the comments.
Yeah. I knew there was a reason why there was paper.
And when I was reviewing it, it appears to, I mean, it just takes sections of the ordinance and has formal questions around them.
It was just one of those things that during the discussions with the town's attorney, there was a question of, which form? And, oh, the ordinance says it's a form approved by the board, and has that happened? And no, I don't think so. And so here we are.
I would move acceptance of the application form as presented.
Is there, well, and before that, was there any other discussion around it? I mean, it's hard to say, are there any questions, because there's the whole ordinance that this pertains to, and that gets into an area that isn't what we should be doing, having not had the consultation with the attorney around this.
And I also say that there are some issues with the ordinance that the town attorney has made note of. And so I think that, just put in the backs of your minds, there will be a larger discussion, and when the ordinance is revisited, if there are tweaks to the form, they'll go along with that.
One of the things that I had raised just in a side email with Dean had to do with Dean's role with the Telecommunications Board, just in terms of, is your role to support the Telecommunications Board kind
I will
of
be your staff.
navigate it, or is your role to help the applicant
No, so I'm not.
make a good
Right.
application? Do you know what I mean?
My role is supporting you. Yeah, I'm in the role of staff. This applicant will be represented by counsel. His
Okay.
attorney will be making their presentation. The town's attorney will be available as needed to answer questions. The application, when it came in, was addressed to the zoning administrator, so it's got Lee Crone's name on it because there's no Revy right now, and Lee is technically the zoning administrator, but as far as I know, Lee Crone won't have any involvement other than he carried the box to my office.
Yeah.
And the application that has been submitted is actually this application that just needs to be approved formally as a form.
Well, it's this amount of stuff.
Based off this stuff.
Well, it is, right, they have the
Answering
form,
these questions.
They have filled it out.
but they've used the form, but they've got supplemental information and diagrams and things. But the form is just something that the ordinance calls for,
And we don't have it.
and it wasn't approved. I will say, this is happening retroactively.
Has the town attorney looked at this?
Yes, they've looked at it.
Okay.
They went through this process of saying, we thought about making or suggesting some tweaks, but we're just holding off on them because we think there are bigger fish to fry with the ordinance, and those will result in more meaningful changes to the form,
Okay.
and that day will come.
Okay, all right.
Probably this is just a cut and paste from a generic, application form, right? I mean,
No,
it's not something that.
it's cut and paste using the ordinance.
But it's probably generic to other towns that
It's-
want, or.
Well, there aren't a lot of towns that have telecom ordinances, but it flows from the ordinance. It's just basically say, ordinance says this, so provide us this answer. The ordinance says that, so provide us this answer.
And for the benefit of anybody watching at home or anybody here, just the Planning Commission serves as the Telecommunications Board, which hasn't been something that's come up recently, but we do have an application that's coming into the town, and therefore, that's the reason for all of this. So that'd be a hearing at a future date. So with that, take a motion to approve the form.
I still move to.
Moved by Stephen. Well, seconded by Jean. All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so the form is approved. Now, moving on to the public hearing on subdivision bylaws. And let's see. First question, are people here for something in particular? I just want to know where to make sure to give the right pauses.
Yeah, I believe a lot of the neighbors here are for the projected zoning law changes to the bowling alley.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. Excellent. Okay. So the hearing on the subdivision bylaws, we have discussed this a few times, but we're leaving it open for more discussion tonight as well. This is the formal hearing. Are there any questions around the text of the changes that we were looking at? Okay. And in summary, for the most part, what this is doing is, one, renumbering the sections that are being referenced, and two, taking into account if something has been approved under the form-based zoning section of the regs, it would not need to be additionally subjected to these.
Yeah, I have maybe 3 slides for
Oh,
the
sure.
audience and audience at home, and
Yeah,
maybe
please.
get you a chance to think about
Indeed.
very simply. So just to give people some context for this, the purpose is to correct those references. Like you said, the amendments to the form-based zoning section, if they're approved, would result in them moving to the back and becoming Article 22. And then this second stated purpose is to revise some definitions, and that would mean that certain things that are currently considered subdivisions, even though you don't normally think of them as subdivisions, it means that they have to go through a review process. And if those definitions, if it's changed, it would mean that if it goes through form-based zoning, then it wouldn't have to go through subdivision review. And the first set of amendments is really affecting just 2 definitions, major subdivision and minor subdivision, and it's where we see things like changing from 17A to 22, and then making it clear here and clear here, and then basically saying if it's accept things reviewed under Article 22. So again, the basic idea is we didn't take care of it when we were doing the original package because it was in a separate ordinance. We're taking care of it now so that we don't have this disconnect. And then the other change is in the definition of subdivision, and this is where there's this conscious decision that's being considered that says essentially, if a project's going to go through the form-based zoning process, it's going to get pretty extensive review. Some of that review would be duplicated through the subdivision review process. So if we rewrite the definition of subdivision to say that when things get approval under form-based zoning, then they're not considered subdivisions, we've taken care of the problem. And so right now, in other words, the definition of subdivision includes shopping centers, multifamily housing projects, elderly housing projects, industrial parks. And if the amendment would be approved, those things, some of them would not be subject to review as subdivisions as long as they'd been approved under form-based zoning. That's the goal.
Yeah, I think everybody is pretty much in line with that in previous discussions. Right.
I know I
If
had a
there are
question
questions.
originally, but I think it goes through the DRB either way, right? So basically doing this just cuts out a second DRB review
It goes to the, projects go to the DRB,
under form-based zoning.
and the DRB would also do subdivision review. So what has happened is, for example, there were projects that had to get subdivision approval and form-based zoning approval. It means there are 2 sets of applications. The hearing
Right.
is hearing notice is a little bit longer.
I think my concern, I just wanted to make sure doing this didn't cut the DRB out of
No,
the
it
process.
doesn't.
So as long as they're going through the DRB one path or the other, then I'm comfortable with it.
Yeah, I agree.
That moved really quickly, and I know the onus is on us to understand everything.
Would you mind using the mic for
Yeah.
the camera?
That moved really quickly, and I understand the onus is on us being here to be up to speed on everything you just said. Would it be too much to ask for somebody to break that down just in layman's terms, kind of a little simpler of where we're at and what we're looking to do so we can better understand what was just discussed?
Sure. Well,
And if you could put in context to how it affects what the bowling alley changes are really driving this, I think it would be doing us all a favor, just so we can
bowling
better
alley is
understand.
separate from the subdivision discussion.
Okay.
So we just went through a lot of work with the form-based code, and separately from the form-based code, which is, what is that hearing on
That's
in
this-
February?
That's
Or did that?
the hearing February 11th.
Yeah, which is that hearing at the select board will then incorporate the form-based code into as a section in the regulations, the current zoning regulations. Separate from the zoning regulation document, there is a subdivision regulation.
Okay.
And it's those definitions that we were just playing with so that if something has been approved under form-based zoning, it wouldn't have to go through a separate approval under the subdivision regs because that's how it was written.
Which it does now.
It would now technically, yes. And the second thing is that the references to the form-based code section were referring to not where that form-based code will be. It was section 17 versus section 22. So that's what those changes were.
I guess one of the simple ways that I look at it is, it's not reducing the amount of scrutiny, it's eliminating duplication of scrutiny.
Okay.
Is how I'm thinking of it.
That helps a
Yeah.
lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of a housekeeping. We have this cumbersome system right now where we have two sets of zoning, and an applicant can opt to do either one. And so how do you make them kind of mesh and calibrate a little bit? And this was sort of an oversight where we were realizing, oh gosh, somebody is in the position of having to go through, two sets of reviews.
So was there one specific request that kind of drove this, where you guys decided to, review it and see if you can streamline it a little bit better, or it's just something you've been working on?
No, it's like if you had a web page and it had a link to section
page.
100, and section 100 became section 120.
Okay.
And so we just, A, needed to change that reference, and B, wanted to make sure that there wasn't duplicity in the process of approvals.
Great. All right, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Certainly. Yes.
Dean had mentioned that the definition of a subdivision would include shopping centers, multifamily housing, was it?
Right now, yes, someone doing apartments,
Right.
even on one piece of land, it gets treated as though you were splitting up land.
Okay.
And I've explained to the board some of the history for these kinds of things is that in the early days of regulations, people used models and they just got passed around. And subdivision models were written with this idea that there might not be zoning regulations. In some places, the first regulation that was adopted was a subdivision regulation. And the people in the community, because for whatever reason, they didn't want zoning, but they were okay with regulations that had a lighter touch, or weren't going to tell someone you can't have a store, or you can't have a restaurant, but you might need to have a big enough lot, or you're going to have to split your land off. So subdivision regulations focus on that. But these models would also sometimes say, but the bigger development, we want to have closer review of those as well. So these models would include, at times, subdivisions, things like shopping centers or multifamily housing projects, because even though they don't involve land, they're bigger projects. And so the thinking was they should have more review. Shelburne is a place where we have both zoning and subdivision regs. And like Kate and others were saying, there's a lot of duplication. Things that were in the regs haven't been taken out when they're in both places. They just are in both places. And this is the kind of change where the board is saying there's duplicative regulation or unnecessary regulation, because if someone does form-based zoning, they're going to be scrutinized. So why also have them go through many of the similar steps that you get through subdivision?
I guess what I'm getting at is, can people go apply using a form-based coding application, I guess, and have something slip through that might not otherwise have been passed on?
Well, for someone to use the form-based zoning regulations, they submit an application and the application gets reviewed.
They submit a form-based zoning application
Yeah,
as
so
opposed to...
form-based zoning is, I guess I would say, think of it as 3 chapters in a book. It's just that the chapters kind of get separated. So form-based zoning is this optional chapter, but if you choose to do it, you're going through a review process. The guy who's building the buildings that are on the Yankee Doodle site, for example, he went to meetings with the Development Review Board and they reviewed the project, and the project plans got circulated and reviewed, and the public got a note. There was a notice in the newspaper, and the neighbors got a notice. So there was not a lack. By choosing to do form-based zoning, it didn't mean that, oh, all hands off. It just means that there's a different set of regulations.
Well, would one set of regulations be more advantageous, let's say, for the bowling alley project than another.
Could be.
That's my concern.
Advantageous for the developer as far as.
And perhaps not for the residents in the immediate area or the residents of the entire town.
Well, a couple things. So as an example, one of the incentives for a developer to use form-based zoning is that it increases the amount of density that would be allowed. So the developer also has the option to go under the standard regulations, but would not be enabled to have that higher density. Part of this whole process is with form-based zoning, it also can be a bit more strict in certain ways, such as stormwater management or contributing to the sense of place that we're trying to build in that corridor. So there are incentives to counterbalance that, density being one of them in that case. So when you say advantageous, sure, but it depends on your perspective. Yeah, it goes both ways.
Yeah.
But it's not any less scrutiny.
Right.
I understand
Yeah.
that part. Does it change the rules, essentially? In the reading that I have done, and I understand it, it's probably this much of a universe of reading on form-based codes and so on. It's a field unto itself, I gather. And there is a trend, a national trend from what I gather. Maybe I'm wrong. But the underlying assumption here is that density is good. Density is desirable by all people in the community. And that's my concern, because if it's not desirable by all people in the community, or people driving through the community, whatever it is, or people in the state, is there a way of people being made aware of this?
Yes, and the form-based zoning process predates my time on this, all of our time on this commission, except for maybe Kate, I think, right?
Yeah.
So yes, there were all kinds of public discussions around that, which led to the Planning Commission having some form-based code drafts to review, and then going through that, publishing an initial review, and then we just recently passed some amendments to that to have things make a bit more sense. I would qualify the comment that more density is good everywhere, because this would be isolated to the form-based zoning overlay, which is effectively the Route 7 corridor. And that is the town plan, and the way that Shelburne has been viewing zoning for quite some time is that the growth happens in the growth areas. Growth area 1 effectively being the village, growth area 2 being that corridor, and then you have rural and commercial and museum districts as well. But in that zone, yes, it would allow for greater density should you go through the form-based zoning process. But that also comes with additional restrictions.
Yeah,
And-
it doesn't sidestep responsibilities for
Right.
other things, like stormwater
And what else?
and architecture.
And architecture actually gives you more
Location.
control over the eventual built outcome. So aesthetically,
Built out what?
the built outcome, the built result.
Oh, outcome, sorry.
Yeah, so in theory, it would be an improved architectural results versus what is under the underlying zoning, the existing zoning. There's no stipulation
There's
about
probably
that at all.
restrictions, I think, on the form-based zoning.
There is, yeah. The idea was Jason referenced the idea of placemaking. So we are one of our the drivers of this project, which went on for many years of planning and discussions, and actually considerable amount of community outreach too, was to improve the appearance of the corridor. So there was a sense of when you had more of a sense of when you had arrived in Shelburne. Right now, it's kind of hard to tell, and so we were.
You can miss the sign easily.
Yes.
The original, the one that was up is gone. I'm
How
not
does
sure.
putting up an apartment building
Yeah.
fit into the aesthetic of driving it?
I'm not sure that
Yeah,
this discussion is
no, it's
relevant
not.
to
I was
this
just gonna say, if we
Right,
could,
right,
if we could
yeah.
hold this until
Yeah.
later, because we need to get through the subdivision
Okay.
hearing
Yeah.
first.
Just want to know when is later.
Yeah.
Sure, well, we're gonna,
One of your meetings, one of the...
no.
No, it's the next
Tonight.
topic
It's
on the
next
agenda.
topic.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we started
Yeah.
with the subdivision
Okay.
hearing, which is
Yeah.
something that was announced, and we just need to do it so those changes can
Yes.
move on to the select board.
And these changes wouldn't affect what
No.
you're talking
Okay.
about. It would, the
Thank you.
project would go through a duplicate review, but they would still be under the form-based code rules. So this change, I don't
This
think,
is
correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that's
part.
addressing your concern. This is,
part.
yeah, this is sort of cleaning up something else.
Yes, and once we get through that, and I am happy that people are here and we welcome to ask questions and happy to explain stuff, but want to make sure we can get through tonight as well. So we have the, on the subdivision regs, we have the proposed bylaw amendment report, which I mean, that is standard, and it references areas in the town plan that support the changes that we're talking about. So if there weren't any comments or discussion points on that, then we could move on to if somebody would be willing to make the motion to close the hearing and approve to forward it.
I move that the public hearing on certain proposed changes to the subdivision bylaw be closed.
Second that.
Well, I think you need
Oh.
to read the middle part.
Do I? Oh,
Yeah.
which would modify the definition of the term subdivision, major subdivision, and minor subdivision, and which were duly warned for this evening. Be closed.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. And the next one?
I move to approve the associated subdivision bylaw change report dated November 14th, 2019, and direct staff to forward, distribute said report and copies of the amendment proposal to the Select Board as required by statute.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, well then that will move on to the select board, and now we can move on to the form-based zoning revision discussion. So that last section was, there's a subdivision regulation document. This is now getting into the general regulations, of which there is a section that includes the form-based zoning overlay that the select board will be approving, that will formally incorporate it into that document in February at their hearing. If it sounds kind of complicated, I've said this before, but just as a general reminder, all of these regulations and the documents we have grown organically over multiple iterations of these boards. One thing that we have been discussing, and hopefully we'll have some discussions on this year, is pursuing the idea of a unified bylaw that would bring a lot of these documents together, streamline it, and make it less complicated. Because as much as anybody filing applications and trying to figure out these rules, as much as they get frustrated, I can assure you that this volunteer board equally has challenges just sorting through stuff. So this board is interested in streamlining where possible, and that was precisely the subdivision thing that we just did, is towards that end. So with the complications and anything that sounds confusing, bear with us.
We're actually trying to become more transparent in the regulations and the work, but it's a long slog to get there.
And with this discussion, there are a couple of issues that we're keeping in mind. One of them is the Champlain Lanes property and the proposal that has been brought to us there. And the latest proposal that we saw differs fairly significantly from what the regulations would allow. So the changes that would need to be done, I think, go beyond what the original intent was, and that's where some discussion would be. And the other one, just to make sure I'm not misspeaking, is is it the Automaster? Yeah, with the perimeter buffers.
Trying to do that retention wall.
Right.
Buffers up, right.
And it does get challenging because there are specific instances, and I would say the Champlain Lanes lot is one of those specific instances where the nature of that lot kind of sets it apart from the other properties along that corridor in terms of what would make sense and what doesn't. And I think originally the proposals that were brought to the board of what they were trying to do were pointing out, for example, that there's the the curb cut that goes into that area is kind of right in the middle of that frontage. And the form-based zoning rules would say that your building envelope needs to be up on that sidewalk or set back from it a certain amount. And since there's a driveway right in the middle of that, it would create a situation where you'd need a building on each side, or you could only build on one side. And then their proposal was saying this would be a better use of land. From my view, they were presenting to us what would make sense to them, and then saying, okay, Planning Commission, is this something that you could work with us on? Can the rules be amended in order to enable some of these things? And that's where this discussion is.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Who's they?
The group that's proposing Champlain Housing Trust and that development process, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what the changes are that don't fit within code that they were requesting?
There's a few, and there have been 2 iterations of this. The couple of the big ones are setback from, like, what they're currently proposing is a greater setback from Route 7 than what the form-based code is asking for. There are some
Density?
potential points around the density in the property because there's technically 2 buildings that are connected. It could arguably be looked at as one building, and so that could bring into consideration, well, if it's viewed as one building, then it exceeds the density. If it's 2 buildings, then it would fit.
Density as far as number of units, number of apartment units,
Correct.
which would be 19 allowed in one
Traditional
building.
zoning would allow 19 elderly units, and the form-based zoning would allow 33, and that's the target for apartments that they're shooting for.
But then there's a maximum,
Between 1 and 2 buildings.
there's a maximum in one building.
The number of units that you can have in a multi-family building under form-based zoning is 24.
24, and they want to go for 33 and put it all in one building instead of in 2 buildings. One
And
of
if you
24 and
look
one
at
of
their
9.
footprint, it's, the way it's presented is 2 buildings that are connected with a walkway, basically.
Well, it's a
But it's-
2-story walkway, yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Which is a discussion point, because that's not exactly how the wording reads, I don't believe.
Is it 19 units under which type of?
Traditional.
Traditional. And that's what we were talking about before, is that a developer would have an option currently in the form-based overlay zone, which is effectively that Route 7 corridor. And there are different character districts within that corridor that may have different allowances. But they could submit an application under regular zoning, which would have the lower density requirement, or they could go with form-based zoning that has a higher density requirement, but then there are other requirements should they go with form-based.
Something to make clear, because I'd had a conversation with Tyler Scott. And I said it earlier, sorry?
Who's Tyler?
Tyler Scott is the architect who is working for Jeff Davis, who is basically working for the Pecors who own the property. Champlain Housing Trust is essentially a potential partner. They would potentially buy a project if it was developed. But the important number that we need to be aware of is that the 19 is the number of age-restricted units that would be possible under conventional zoning. And this is something that got lost in the weeds last time. The number of non-age restricted would be more like 7 or 8.
Okay.
So it's 7 or 8 non-age restricted units, 19 elderly or age-restricted units under traditional zoning, but then you jump from 19 to 33 under form-based zoning.
What age restricted also?
The age restriction is 55 and over, I believe.
But for form-based zoning is also?
Well, there's nothing analogous in form-based zoning like that.
No age restrictions.
Right, it doesn't, there's not a, right,
Age
a
restriction.
unit is a
bonus.
unit under form-based zoning.
Is there something else about a slanted roof, I remember? Can you share that with us?
Well, they're proposing a flat roof in the building. They did a massing diagram, but the building, form-based zoning uses building types as a as a part of the regulation. So if you use a building type, that means you can do certain things. And the building type they would use is the multifamily building type. They're doing multifamily housing. They would use the multifamily building type. That building type allows for flat roofs. It's not like it's, it does allow for flat roofs. It's not like it's the ideal, and this is where things, in my mind at least, this is where things like the design of the building and whether it's one or two, it's where the negotiating takes place, you know, between a developer and a board, just kind of generally speaking, where the board says, hey, you know, we want, you know, we realize you can have a flat roof, but it's kind of a plain looking building, so dress it up. But a flat roof is possible. The question would be, you know, are they going to be able to do a flat roof building within the height restrictions that are allowed under the form-based zoning? Because I don't remember them.
Also, number of stories that they were.
Well, that's the other. I mean, that
looking for more stories.
That I think will end up depending on how small a footprint they have and how tall they have to go. That I don't have off the top of my head, but I guess I would say it's possible. I'm not thinking of changes to the allowable building height as one of the main things. In my understanding, the main things are the build-to line, or just this idea of the setback, which isn't really used much in the form-based zoning, except that it is the starting point for the build-to zone occupancy. So build-to line, the build-to zone, which is basically how close and how far, and then the build-to zone occupancy. And these are just, I know these are just words, but it's three related concepts that all have to do with how close to the road does the building need to be, basically. And there are different ways that if the commission was interested, and I guess I'd like to suggest that you try to pull this back and think more globally and not just about one particular property,
Right.
because you could pull up the image showing the regulating plan to get an idea that, oh, there's already a part of the corridor where you say 100 feet back rather than between 10 and 30.
And I think that's a good point, and this is why in our last discussion, to me, this is just a very unique lot that just doesn't really fit with the intentions behind form-based as it is, and there's always the, well, you know, if it doesn't fit for that particular purpose, then maybe that's unfortunate, and we should seek out what else could go in there, or, you know, the market will play that out. The problem, though, is in these discussions, because of where that driveway is, and on top of that, I drove by it a few times just to remind myself of the discussion, and there is the access road that comes out of the mobile home park that cuts across right there. And there was some good discussion around that, and you had mentioned school buses being able to get in and turn around and that sort of thing. And with the form-based zoning, I struggled to imagine what would fit in there nicely. And so I just think that's a consideration. It's a really wacky lot design. So to me, I don't know that it's worth changing regulations to fit to enable something like this to fit in there versus exploring how something like waivers or a variance or something could be uniquely assigned to that lot.
And there are already waivers in the form-based zoning. It's just that they're small, and so one thing that the board could consider would be to change the waivers, but then you'd have some choices about how you do it.
And it would apply universally unless you made it very specific to that.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily agree with what Tyler was presenting as being like a wacky lot and unbuildable lot. In my viewpoint, I'm seeing it a little differently. I feel like it is a doable lot, and that maybe they're just trying to do too much on that lot. And I also drove by it and looked at the dual access to the mobile home park, and it's the main entry in is clearly a main entry in, and they've been able to go through the parking lot of the bowling alley. But to me, that's not something that really needs to be maintained, just to get them to be able to take a left turn to go north on Route 7. That they can do like everybody else and, do a U-turn by pulling out to the right. So I just don't think they were trying hard enough to make the site work. And they were kind of throwing out something to see that, see what we would think.
Jump 2 lanes of traffic at 40 miles an hour.
Yeah, and actually, we really, if anybody's talking, we really need to use the microphone for the webcast.
There's no traffic light there?
Yeah, is there actually I was looking more at the road in front of Champlain Lanes. Is there currently an exit out of the mobile home park that allows
There
the
is
left
currently,
and
yeah.
right?
There is, but you have to turn right.
But it goes
You have to
right.
go
You have to turn
yeah.
right. There's two, I'm looking at it now, there's 2 exits.
Yeah,
actually.
okay.
And then you
They
would
both
go-
turn right.
If you want the light, you use the Shelburne Lighting House is where you would turn around. Where the bagel place is and the Shelburne, that, if you wanted to head left, you would take a right.
Otherwise, you use a little road, and then you take the light at Martindale.
Right, and I do want to clarify, I wasn't really talking in terms of what Tyler Scott had proposed as the uniqueness and that in his argument for the unique lot. I was just saying, in general, that lot is unique compared to the other lots in that corridor, given the orientation of the driveway and the frontage required, like the building frontage in the Build 2 zone, given where that driveway is. You're absolutely right, though. I think a design could happen that is set back a little further that would still allow that entrance to happen. And that gets into the engineering and different proposals.
Yeah, I mean, I even think it could meet the setback requirements if they were really trying to do that. But I think part of it was they were trying to present something that would be saleable, which would mean a greater number of units that face the view to the lake. They were trying to orient the building more parallel to the road so that you get that view on half of the units rather than put it like longer into the site. That's my opinion, and they pretty much said that they were trying to do that.
Do we have a copy of the slide we can put up tonight of what that proposition was that they shared?
I don't.
They took that with them? That's not for us to look at publicly?
No, they came to a public meeting. It's on, the webcast is on.
No, I mean now, it's not something we can just throw up on the screen. It's not in the books or in the records or whatever you would call the electronic copy?
Because realistically, we've got 40 minutes on this topic left, and so I want to, it's not specifically to talk about what they were proposing. It's more just what the rules are and what makes sense in terms of potential changes. There will be no final decisions made tonight. This isn't a formal hearing. We're not putting anything into the regulations. This is just a discussion. So your inputs are great. That material is available, but that wasn't something I think we were prepared to look at. We're more looking at the actual regs.
Was a waiver already made that space doesn't have to have retail in it? Now, this is just something I heard through the grapevine. Was there a requirement in the form that there had to be retail as well as housing, and the retail part was already removed, or commercial, I should say?
Initially, do you have the regulating plan thing that could be popped up?
Because that would be one waiver already that was approved.
Not a waiver.
Virginia waiver.
Yeah, it was a proposed change, but initially there were, in the regulating plan shows the form-based zone overlay, and in that initially there were 3 what we were calling nodes that were identified that would have some unique characteristics. And primarily, it was that those buildings needed to be closer to Route 7, because the idea of these nodes was that they'd be compact, walkable, there'd be a bigger concentration in those areas. That's what that is.
What is a node?
It was...
Well, maybe the way to think about it is right now, one of the challenges with Route 7 in terms of, it being sort of a place that people want to go to and linger on and sort of hang out in, maybe in contrast to the Village, for example, is that it's just all car-oriented. It's a highway, and there's from South Burlington to, just south of Bay Road, it's just kind of undifferentiated, just car-oriented places. So These are some older buildings. You've noticed many vacancies, things like that. So how do you, which are creating very expensive stormwater problems for all of us, among other problems. So how do you revitalize a place like this? What could it become next? That was really the question that we were trying to pursue with the zoning regulations, and why we decided to pursue this type of zoning as an option for redevelopment. And so the idea was that we would, bearing in mind our substantial stormwater challenges and the fact that there's some impaired streams through the corridor, we would want to encourage redevelopment that would avoid some of those areas. We're not taking people's development rights away, but we didn't want to increase them in those areas because it would not make sense. That said, it seemed like there were opportunities to, where there were some places where there was kind of gathering and commercial activity very successfully happening that we wanted to try and encourage. So an example would be the Shelburne Bay Shopping Center. That's kind of like a local, thriving little hub, you know. Could that become even more thriving and more, you know, have more stuff going on? That was one of the questions that we were trying to address. So that's an example of an area that under the zoning is envisioned as a kind of local hub where folks in the neighborhoods behind could ideally in the future maybe walk there, and there'd be, I don't know, ice cream shops and, you know, just places to sit out front and have dinner and those kinds of things that are sort of happening, but like we would want to try and encourage more of it to happen. And then another node is the one that is down where the Healthy Living is proposed to locate, so in the around the old jelly mill area. And so then there was a third node that had been proposed further up, really around the Martindale intersection. And it, you know, when you, it was just becoming apparent that maybe we were a little too ambitious. That the demand for retail was just not materializing. So it takes forever to pass zoning changes, and so we get this thing passed right as the bottom is falling out of the retail market. Yes, and so and you've probably noticed there's some places in Burlington that have had a very hard time leasing out the ground floor retail, and the place where Small Dog has relocated to is a great example. So we thought, gosh, if they're struggling, how are we going to? We can't compete with Burlington as it is. So, you know, how maybe we need to scale back a little bit. And so that was what we just did in the last zoning review that is before the select board right now. So that was to eliminate, and one of the things that came out of that was to eliminate the requirement for ground floor uses. You can have them, but you don't have to have them.
Across the board, it's not by special request, it's now the rule.
For that.
For that node.
For that Martindale node.
Yeah.
The red ones, what Dean's showing, the red areas on Route 7 are the nodes that Kate is talking about. And the Martindale one is the top one. The one below is where the meat market and everything is, right? So we proposed removing the top node instead of trying to create two things so close, thinking that they would not thrive and not necessarily benefit all the way around.
It doesn't preclude somebody from doing it, but it doesn't make it a requirement that they have to.
Why would you do that?
Again, it was to respond to just changing commercial market demand, which just wasn't there.
So it was done before the request for the changes with the bowling alley. That was already in place. That wasn't something you guys did specifically to accommodate their.
Well, and, yeah, you need the mic too. But I don't remember the order of operations there, but I mean, it was all part of that mix.
Yeah, I think that we might have heard about the bowling alley before we made the change, but it wasn't done for it. I think the discussion, and they brought up the problem with the ground floor, and it seemed, talking about it, like it did make more sense to have something residential there rather than commercial. And so it wasn't done to make their project go through, but it was a concern that they raised. Correct me, guys, if I'm
Other developers.
understanding. Yeah. So it wasn't a waiver for them. Yeah. No, it's an understandable question.
One of the reasons for having the node there in the first place was because at the time that the zoning was going through, the mobile home park was not owned by the residents, and so that could have, we were looking at, well, gosh, this could become anything in the future. So we were trying to you try and create regulations that will work for 25, 50 years in the future, and then when the mobile home park became something that was a permanent thing, the area all of a sudden had a much more residential quality than it previously had, kind of now sort of baked in going forward. And so it didn't seem compatible to require commercial uses for anything to redevelop in that area. It seemed like we needed to be more flexible.
At that same point, you're kind of contradicting your vision, because now you have residents in that area, the mobile home park, which is going to stay long-term, who can support and use that retail space, should it be a coffee shop or something like that. So
it doesn't mean that it can't be that. It's just, it doesn't have to be that, yeah. Because oftentimes residential areas will, like types kind of congregate together.
As long
Yeah.
as the Champlain Housing Trust owns it.
No?
This isn't, they don't own it now. This is something that they're proposing, and they've come to this board saying that there are things that they would like to do that currently zoning won't allow them to do.
I drove by there on the way here, and there was a Shelburne cruiser right up front. And they've been there all the time. And my car gets broken into since I moved in there, never before, and now they're buying another property in my neighborhood. And I'm having a hard time with this.
Noted.
No, it's not noted. I would like to know how many times the Shelburne police go to the inn down there on Route 7 versus anywhere else, and you'll start to see a pattern where there's an anomaly. And now you're going to drop that exact same anomaly right into another property 2 doors down.
I don't think it's the same, it's not the same clientele in both of those projects.
And I'd also just like to clarify that this is a planning commission that's looking at regulations. We don't run the police department. We can't say to if the zoning.
You say that the Shelburne Saloon would be an adult entertainment either, that my 2 daughters would have to drive by. I mean, what do you guys do? Like you could say, well, we couldn't do that either, but you could pass an ordinance like the rest of Chittenden County did, and you finally did, that says there's no adult entertainment in Shelburne. But my 2 daughters would have had to drive by that every day, twice a day, 2, 3, 4 times a day. So don't dismiss these things.
How would you?
My car gets broken into and everything else, my house gets broken into. Like, don't dismiss that, because I live in that neighborhood. How many of you people live in that neighborhood?
I do.
And I'm not dismissing you. I'm just saying that's not something that we're going to solve right now. That's not part of this. We are not changing the zoning. We're having a discussion around what our current rules are and what some proposals are that have come to us. I mean, it's a whole separate conversation. I mean, you're not going to be able to talk if you don't have the mic anymore. We're not evaluating this in terms of what is specifically going in there now. We're looking at it from a regulatory. That particular lot is unique, so that's going to be impacted by whatever it is compared to the rest of the zone. If you're not going to use the mic, I'm going to have to ask you to stop talking.
The railroad buys a piece of land and then they sublease it out to the salt space. It's the same thing, right? You're allowing Pico to do it, who's going to lease the land.
You're still talking without the mic, and that's just.
But it's the same thing.
All right, we're going to move on. So, for the purpose of this discussion, we have some related regulations in front of us that are in our packets, and this is what I'd like us to try and get through in the next 30 minutes. And I am happy to entertain stuff, but that particular point isn't, like, we don't have control over where cruisers go, and it's a separate discussion anyway.
But we also don't have control over what developer wants to develop a certain site.
Right.
We can't say in our zoning regulations, no low-income housing. that would be discriminatory. And so we can't say that, even if the whole town wanted to say that.
To provide context, I'm still relatively new to the board, so I've been learning a lot of this. What we do is set the rules for all of this of what kind of things, not in terms of low-income housing or not, but what can be built. And so you take community input, and we're a small town, so often one project, two projects will raise concerns about zoning that doesn't make sense or rules that don't make sense. So people will come and present projects here. It's not our place to approve of their project or not approve of their project, but what we do is take the information from people who come in to talk to us, from developers who come in to talk to us, and say either maybe there's a change that needs to be made to the regulations because there's something that isn't right or isn't aligning with our town plan, or that's a separate issue that needs to be dealt with in a different way and isn't something that we change the zoning for. Is that a fair assessment, Dean?
I'm saying even if we decided to make
Changes in the regs, it's still not our job to approve it. It still has to go through the approval process. The project, the individual project.
May I ask?
Yeah, it's more for the webcast.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying about you're working on the regulations, the rules, the outline. I think, though, that I guess I two things. Who does control what comes into this town, whether it's adult entertainment? What committee decides?
That's
The regulations themselves have uses. So there are permitted uses and there's conditional uses. And in the case of adult entertainment, the reason that that ordinance was put in place is because there wasn't previously an ordinance around that, so that was put in place to say that that use can only be done in certain areas. And there were people saying, well, you can't have it at all, and that gets into First Amendment things, and you can't do that. So it was restricted to particular areas. That's how that played out. So I think to answer your question, there are defined uses for spaces. Some of them are explicitly permitted, some of them are conditional, and some of them don't exist.
And we set those uses, but we don't approve specific projects.
Right.
Is there a committee that does?
The DRB, the Development
Review Board.
Yes.
So they look at the zoning and planning rules and say if a project fits those rules or not. So if you have a concern with the general rules for an area or for the town, this is where that's raised. And specific instances can help bring things to our attention, but we don't say, yes, you can build that particular project or not.
Right.
If that helps.
So I think part of the dilemma, or what's hard to understand, is if you're in charge of the rules, but you're talking about the potential waiving of those rules for a particular project to go in, such as this one, that seems that you're changing the rules to accommodate an individual developer, as opposed to holding on to the rules and saying, these are the rules. If you can't get enough units in there to satisfy your budget, I guess look somewhere else. These are the rules.
Valid. And to clarify, though, and that's what I was trying to get at, is that I don't want to look at this discussion through the lens of what was specifically proposed, because at the end of the day, if what they want to do doesn't fit within the regulations that we're putting forth, they won't be able to do it anyway. What is interesting is some of the issues raised about that lot, the way that it's oriented. One thing that we previously mentioned is the node got taken out because in that space it no longer makes sense to have a node through the lens of initially that it seemed to make sense. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going through and looking at changes to enable that project. It's more saying, when I was talking about waivers, it's specific to that lot. Because in order to make changes that would make, I think, the development that's envisioned in the corridor to fit in that lot, there would need to be changes that would be applicable everywhere in that particular zone. And so the waiver would be to limit it to that space somehow uniquely.
And is the discussion happening, though, because they come up with this proposal and they're actually requesting these changes, and so they're being considered? as
It's-
opposed to the residents, the people that live near there, and our wishes and potentially proposals.
And I see that perspective. I can say that's not specifically how I'm looking at it. We have, this board has issues that come to us, and there was a change to the rural, to the rural district that was done, and arguably that eventual change, the discussions started with some residents that came in and made a request and said, here's what the regulations say, here's what we're trying to do, the regs won't let us do it. That change didn't go into place because they asked that directly. It was, they presented with an issue. We went through well over a year of having this on agendas and discussions and looking at it from a variety of angles, and ultimately came up with a solution that, yes, did happen to satisfy what they were going for, but it was the result of discussing our regulations and saying, does this make sense, does it not? And in the same way that the amendment package to the form-based zoning is coming before the select board next month, that was initially passed at the end of 2017? Yeah. So in that amendments package, in large part, came from us spending multiple meetings going through and saying, okay, given current conditions and given what we know now, and given the fact that we have had some applications come through, we might have had developers say, we're going to take traditional zoning instead of form-based because of these issues. And that all went into the consideration pile because we want developers to use form-based zoning. That was the intention behind it because it does have benefits to it.
And now that the place next door with the trailers, the mobile homes, I should say, they do own it, so the circumstance has changed, and so maybe keeping it more, and there's a huge neighborhood there. We would love to have an ice cream shop and a coffee shop there and not have it be residential, but it does seem like the tail wagging the dog, that there's a proposal to have this enormous complex that doesn't fit the zoning, to adjust the zoning to meet the developer's need, which is not the residents of Shelburne that live, a mile radius all around it, including the mobile home park next door.
Which is a fair observation, and that's why this is a public input thing. This isn't, yeah, absolutely.
We haven't made any decisions yet.
Right.
This is on the agenda tonight just to have this conversation.
Exactly.
Absolutely
Is
no
there a hard
decision has been
timeline
made.
for the decision?
No.
Or is it kind of floats?
I mean, I'll state that with authority, but
Yeah,
We'll look
no,
to
I
Jason.
agree.
I'm having trouble understanding why there is not, I'm thinking of a flow chart, backing up. I'm thinking of a flow chart. If a developer wants to develop something, it will have everything to do with the rules.
Mhm.
So there is a relationship. It may not be, the flow chart may not read 1, 2, regulations, development, but your work does have a direct relationship, if not indirect, on the outcome, to use Kate's word.
Sure. No,
And so it is
Yeah.
important to really think carefully, I feel, because you're the beginning of that flow chart.
Certainly. No
So
argument.
maybe a way to think about this is, last meeting, we had the person who wants to do something with this property come and state their point of view and their side of things. And this meeting, we're hearing what the neighbors think. And, and somewhere in the middle of that is the balance. And that's really our job, is to take all of this input and, we haven't heard from the property owner. We've just heard from a potential partner that might work with the property owner. So it's, everybody has rights in this to be heard. And we have to, we have to respectfully listen and consider all the viewpoints. And I think, if I'm hearing you all correctly, are saying that you're saying to us, respect the rules that you have.
I guess I'm saying, if, maybe it'd be good for everybody to take the mic and just go around the room, because I don't know what your concerns are. I'm not hearing what your concerns are. about this project. And so we're trying to address the concerns, but I feel that it's to me, it's not been stated.
I think really it comes down to, and I'm not, it's not my opinion, but I think the opinion of a lot of people is that they don't want low-income housing near them. They're worried, as Jay's pointed out, he's worried about break-ins and things like that, a different type of clientele. And I understand that you cannot regulate where these things go. The other thing I'd like to point out is I'm familiar with the project at the beginning, at the corner of Flynn and Pine. And the first project that was presented there, or was developed there, proposed, only had about 10 residential units, and the ground floor, like it is now, was to be commercial. That was unviable to the banks in terms of lending money. So that project now has close to, I think, around 30 units, which made it feasible from a financial point of view. So I think these guys, and I understand also, I mean, I live in the neighborhood. I don't walk anywhere. I drive down to the store. So it's a car-oriented area. The whole corridor is car-oriented. It's always was. It's always going to be for the next 150 years. And trying to get little shops working individually there is, I mean, the Fiddler's Green thing was an attempt at one time, and it failed miserably.
You mean the Teddy Bear Common?
Teddy Bear Common, yeah. It failed miserably because it was trying to be what everybody envisions a little village of shops to be, and it doesn't work in a car-oriented society. So I understand why they want to, not have, I don't think commercial space in that location is viable from an economic point of view, and they need much higher density to make their project economically feasible.
But that's not the concern, though.
No, well, the concern that everybody seems to be, they don't want low-income people around.
I have a little bit different concern. My name's Anthony. I live right up the block from there. I've been in Shelburne now. I own my home for, I think, 16 years. I moved from Queens. I grew up in low-income housing, so I know about it probably more than most people in this room. There's really nothing wrong with it per se. I think what's wrong is we're trying to put a square peg into a round hole, because for what they're proposing, the size of the building that they're putting there and what that lot is, you're basically isolating the residents of that building, where you don't walk to the supermarket. There is no supermarket when you're there. Hannaford's is way too far, and Shelburne Supermarket's too far. You don't walk to the library. You can't walk to the school from there. That Route 7 corridor is, I think, the third busiest road in the state. My two young children, 13 and now 15, they've always had a rule. If I let them walk down to the liquor store to buy candy, they're never allowed to cross the street there. Because when I'm at that light and I watch cars go by, every time it turns green for Martindale, there's always that one guy still doing 50 trying to blow it. I'm thinking about a low-income housing project like that with 30-something units. You're going to have a lot of children. A lot of low-income people have children. That's a fact. We put a playground right there in that parking lot. I don't know how familiar you guys are with the layout, but it's feet from the sidewalk. So you're going to have to put a fence up now. Now it looks like these people are caged in this square, this big square behemoth building with this big fence so kids don't run into traffic, with this tiny little playground that looks like it was just put there for the sake of having a place for the kids to play. And I've seen a lot of that growing up in the city. These tiny little things, they invest in a swing set and a slide and they call it a playground. There's really no place for the children to play who are gonna live in that area, and we're basically putting it up there. And if it doesn't look pretty like Harrington Village with all these nice slanted little village roofs and little buildings, it just doesn't work for that space for what they want. There could be another space that maybe makes sense, but that one seems like there's so many sweeping rule changes and zoning changes that need to happen to make it work. I think they're in it. If it was less units, maybe there'd be more open space you can do, but for what the size of the project that they're positioning, it just doesn't fit well for what it is, and that's my concern for the most part.
Apart from it being a car-oriented area, it is a huge truck. I don't know what kind of trucks you call them. They're 18-wheelers. It is busy, and I can't imagine children playing near those trucks. Those trucks throw stones. The noise is unbelievable. I'm afraid to walk on that area of Route 7 because I'm afraid of having a stone thrown by the tires. I never walked my dog along there because I was afraid that the dog would be hurt. Could be flying metal, it could be a piece of gravel. Just wouldn't do it. I don't see it as viable as a residential area. Could be made into an open space, I don't know. By the way, we are neighbors, but we're not just neighbors. We're taxpayers, and we help pay the water bills. And we contribute economically to not just Shelburne, but South Burlington and Burlington. So we're not just the neighbors.
Can I ask, you said you don't see it viable as housing. Do you see it more viable as an economic, like that zone that had been originally proposed? And
I don't know.
It's not an attack on what you're saying.
No, I
I'm
understand.
honestly
I don't
trying to
know
sort it
what
out.
the answer is. I'd be delighted if it were open space because it gives me a sense that I'm near the lake. There's light that pops up. I don't know whether that makes sense economically these days.
We all know that.
But
Unless it's private, then you.
Yeah, unless you want to buy it. I think that's the
exactly.
thing, yeah.
I understand. It's idealistic.
Well, I think, the benefit of having more housing there, it is on the bus line. The more density you can create along a route that has a bus line makes mass transit that much more affordable and economically viable. The more density you can put on the lot, it makes the lot economically more viable. So I think there's, you got to build. Neither you can keep spreading out like we do and taking up farmland, or you can build where we've already, messed up the land.
And that's exactly the intent behind the town plan and the growth areas and where this is. And I would just comment as something to think about, not as not to argue what you were saying, but just as an observation that the idea of having residences close to Route 7 and that it gets really dangerous and people get hit by rocks and stuff, that would mean no residential along Route 7, which there are already projects. There's plenty of cities around that have residential against busier roads. So we're not.
The Palace 9 Theater?
Yeah, that building is an example of it. The intent behind this, there are multiple building types within form-based code that can be used. A mixed residential, mixed use is one of them. There are lots of others. The point behind the form-based zoning is to enable flexibility for what appeals to developers, but then fits within that sense of place concept and gives some identity to Shelburne. So we're not, there's no intention to dictate what goes into any of these spaces. That is up to effectively the market forces. And again, I would caution that yes, we do have what was proposed as here is somebody who is a prospective form-based zoning developer, and these are the challenges they see with the form-based zoning itself. And again, because of the uniqueness of that lot, there are some limitations around it. And I'm not necessarily thinking of it in terms of their specific proposals. And some of the things that they've asked for, being honest, just are not likely to happen at all. But we would hear that the same way that we're hearing and getting the opinions of people in the area as well.
Describe what are the peculiarities of that lot? I know what it looks like today, but I don't know it in the context of what you're describing.
It was, well, I'll do it within the context of part of the reason why we removed it as a node. And it was the idea that there's a curb cut, a driveway right off of Route 7 that's sort of right in the middle of the frontage. And the form-based zoning, there's a certain setback that building envelope needs to be within, like the building itself needs to be within that or a percentage of it. And having it bisected is a challenge, regardless of what goes in there. Not to say there aren't possibilities.
Yeah, a certain
Right.
percentage of the building has to be as close to the road as that build-to zone requires in the form-based zoning. And the form-based zoning is trying to get buildings closer to the road rather than far to the back of the lot with all parking in front. So it's trying to reverse that.
My question had to do with why does the driveway have to stay in the same place?
The traffic light.
Oh.
It's right there. Yeah.
And
I just wanted to say, I don't really see that as a very unique lot. I'm hearing one uniqueness. It seems like we should try to stick as close to the rules as we can.
I'm just going to, are we closed? Anybody else would like to? We really appreciate the volunteer work that you guys do. We just want to put faces in the neighborhood there and some of the concerns that the neighbors have, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, that's how people feel. So thank you for letting us share that. Finally, when you guys are thinking about changing the rules, and I know we can't dictate what goes there, obviously the rules of the, that's for the businesses. But if we do know it's going to be low-income housing, and I'll say this again, having a liquor store across the street, I want you to think about that when you consider changing the rules. A liquor store within walking distance of low-income housing is a potential problem in the future. I grew up in a place where there were liquor stores on every corner, and it's trouble. So I'm speaking out of school here. I know that's not something I could back up with data, but I want you to think about that because we have a lot of issues with Harbor Place. It was presented through rosy lenses, and I think it's been quite a blight on the neighbors and the community overall. So there's the real world, and then there's what people want to say in here when they're pitching their projects and how it's going to look in the future. So consider that when you think about changing the zoning rules as well. Thank you.
And I've listened to what everyone has said here tonight in terms of commercial versus residential, and I see both sides of the story. One of my concerns as far as what was discussed earlier in terms of the distribution of age-restricted housing, et cetera, one of my concerns has always been accessibility. And so when we look at age-restricted 55 and above, and I think about, I work with people all the time who have no transportation, and I think about residential in that area, and yes, it's on a bus line, but people with no transportation or who rely on public transportation often have mobility issues as well. And going to the grocery store is a day's project for them, essentially. I see it every single day in the work that I do. And so I think that, John was saying that, or people are saying something's going to be built there. I don't know if there's a right answer, but I think that taking into account what Anthony said, which clearly very passionate about your experience, and I really appreciate the information you've shared. I just wanted to add that other piece about the residential piece and the age restricted, just bringing something else to the table to think about. So.
One last smaller point, but I see it every day, is that having a liquor store there, and this is not necessarily about the liquor store, but it's in relationship to housing. Having the liquor store there already presents some danger in the way that people take the turns in there, and they're not safe necessarily all the time. It's not safe driving from my standpoint. There have been a number of close calls that I've observed or been stuck in the middle of Route 7 because of it. It's just overall a hazardous intersection.
Thank you all for your inputs. I would say again, it's important to, and I would encourage everybody just because I wasn't in a position to be able to engage on a board for a while just because I was out of town a lot. But once I was able to do that, it gave me a lot better insight into how government works and what the different boards and commissions do. Your question was to that as well. So we as the Planning Commission are regulatory, and then the DRB is where they're quasi-judicial, and they would actually hear the specific applications. This is kind of unique in that it's form-based code. It's a little bit new, and we are trying to encourage development. And if in the beginning, when it wasn't being selected, we wanted to understand why, and there were developers that were willing to come in and say, this is why we weren't selecting it, and that has led to some revisions. Again, not to facilitate a specific project, but more to get back to the intent behind form-based zoning and ensure that we have fewer lots that sit open. Referencing, somebody mentioned the Sirloin Saloon earlier. It's been vacant ever since I moved here in 2007. So these are all things that we're trying to do, and it's long-term, and these things don't tend to move very fast. So the adult entertainment thing is the fastest thing I've ever seen happen because of the reaction to that. But yeah, really appreciate you all being here and continuing to ask questions, and I hope this can remain just an open process. And I honestly am not trying to be dismissive or anything, but there are issues with the webcast if the mic's not being used and that sort of thing. So trying to keep it all in line. Right, yeah.
Speak loud enough.
Right, it's not a technicality, but or it is a technicality.
And please note that, we are doing everything we can to improve on the conditions on Route 7. Those properties, many of them are at the end. Well, they've passed the ends of their lives, and so how do we incentivize thoughtful, desirable redevelopment? And so the zoning was really, this type of zoning was an attempt to try and do that, rather than just leave it all up to chance, and then we could end up with just kind of more of that highway-oriented sort of stuff that I don't think is really, greatly admired anymore. So, yeah.
With that said, once we open it up, this would be the first project like this on Shelburne Road, 3 stories, underground parking lodge, 20-plus units. Correct me if I'm wrong, from here all the way to the town village, there's no other major building like that for residential. Am I correct?
Well,
something that's coming about the Yankee Doodle site will have 2 buildings of 24 units each, age restricted.
Age restricted.
And that will be.
Okay. Well, with these changes, this might be opening the door for the whole corridor from here to the village with plenty more apartment buildings. So we can become suddenly the Lego-shaped entrance into the town of apartment buildings, and we certainly don't want that. So any change that's made now, this might be one development that takes advantage of it, but who's to say with all these vacant properties, and it's so easy to get subsidized government housing projects done. Contractors love it, developers love it, you have guaranteed clients. So this can open up the door for a whole corridor of apartment buildings where then you guys can't say who can and can't build because we have too many. So just think about, sweeping rule changes have an effect not just for one property, but for potentially a dozen.
And they're all, and that's a good point. Yes, agreed. There are also, what's the word? The town plan explicitly references an average growth trajectory. And any growth that happens needs to be in line with the infrastructure that is needed to support it. So, for example, if it wouldn't be that you'd have 10 giant, fully loaded, high-density apartment buildings happening in a finite period of in a short period of time, because that would trigger needs to improve infrastructure, and that would be a qualifier for the DRB review. So there are a lot of other mechanisms in here that are at play. But on the surface, yes. I mean, the idea behind form-based zoning, and there are different character districts along that corridor, including a green corridor, and there's some commercial area as well. But yes, theoretically, a developer could come in and say, we want to buy up all of this space on Route 7 and just make it rows and rows of tall buildings. I think the odds of that happening are fairly low, and getting that approved would be next to impossible because of the required infrastructure upgrades.
But that said,
Okay.
Anthony, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to maintain the form-based zoning and not change it just because the form-based zoning, to address your issue about the speed of the cars and all that stuff, what form-based zoning was trying to do was to get enough density on the road so that there was life on the road, there were people on the sidewalks, and then that in turns kind of like gives the visual cue for the people driving their cars to go a little slower. The people are going to, if the conditions are such that they can go fast, people are going to go fast. But the idea of good planning, and that's what form-based zoning is trying to do, is that you put the infrastructure in there to make it a nice neighborhood feeling, rather than a highway with car lots and buildings set way back from the street, no man's land kind of thing at the street. People are going to drive faster. So this whole thing is trying to get people to drive slower and get life on the street. And there's always that thing. There's going to be kids, that cross the street and danger and things like that. But the whole thing is trying to minimize the danger, like get people to slow down.
I think it's fairly obvious to me that Route 7 used to be residential, strictly. You see the remnants of neighborhood, and you see these houses have been neglected and abandoned. They're rental, they're in shambles in that area.
Single-family residential.
Yeah. If I know that where Anthony grew up, I don't know it because I wasn't living there, but it used to be farmland. And it became wall-to-wall apartment buildings, and some developers did buy and just built biggest scale they could possibly manage. Every square inch was full.
And that's why with
And
these
crime became much
Sure.
worse, and costs for the communities became higher, and it became impossible for individual families to keep their own homes. My relatives live there.
You talk about Queens?
Yeah.
And I'll just say, Google Queens Boulevard. Its nickname is Boulevard of Death. More people get hit by cars on the boulevard because it's 4 lanes, just like Route 7. People don't always cross at lights.
I used to live there, yeah.
You know it?
I know it, yeah.
People don't cross at lights. They cross it where it's most convenient for them. So if your apartment building's here, it doesn't always mean you're going to go to the crosswalk. You're going to go to where it makes sense, and that's how people get hit by cars. Because it's dark out at 4:30 in the winter, and the kid thinks he can beat the traffic, and the guy's not paying
Well, that
attention.
happens all the time from the mobile home park to the store. It happened at Harbor Place, a guy from Harbor Place.
And I think, yeah, without the
It's not always.
yeah, without the mic, we're really, it's just going to be confusing for the online stream.
We really do appreciate the input, and it's helpful for us to hear, since the goal is to improve the community for everyone in it. So it's helpful to hear different perspectives and what you're encountering in the neighborhood, so we can take that into account when we're looking at all of this. So we do appreciate you guys coming, and often this room is empty, so it's nice to have
Right.
some feedback.
I like that you guys are sitting in the same spots, this way I could remember. Next time I'm playing musical chairs.
Right.
That's kind of why we all join, also to make it a better place, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very generous.
Yeah.
So there's no gavel dropping, but should we leave so you can go on to your next?
No, you're welcome to stay. We
okay.
actually weren't able to get into the actual discussion that we were going to have. So I would add, yeah, you're welcome to stay. You can go if you're more comfortable. We generally try to end around 9 o'clock. That doesn't always work, but your call. Thank you for being here, though, either way.
I keep coming up with one last thing. When I read the change to form-based zoning from a couple of years ago, I tried to read it. To be honest, I couldn't figure out what it was really about. I did very well in my education process. I have good reading comprehension, but I find the minutes, even the agendas, very difficult. I know that you're in a technical line of work here, and I really do appreciate how much work you are doing. I wouldn't have, I'm not as generous, but it is so hard as a person who's not in this field to even perceive, to grasp what those form-based zoning changes were about.
On the agenda.
The meeting notes and so on, I was trying to read through them, and I thought, why is this happening? I'm glad that I came, because I've learned you want to make it more economically viable and not just kind of a dead zone. But it's a dead and it's a dangerous zone, and for reasons.
Yeah, and part of this that really helps, and again, really appreciative for people being here, because I think even for me, it wasn't until I engaged in the process and started paying attention, and just by the nature of being on this commission and needing to attend some other things to understand what's going on, I'm into my 4th year right now, and I learn something every meeting. So it's not, and there are things that I don't think I've got the right degree for. But it's more just about just keeping an eye on announcements that happen, and it's an over time kind of thing. You start to understand how things work, and that doesn't always make sense. So part of what this commission is trying to do, just through the nature of things as they come up, is to streamline things where possible. For example, that subdivision, just clearing up some definitions. And hearing input is always a great thing, because otherwise it's just seven volunteers.
It's actually critical to
Yeah.
what we do to get input, because really the regulations are the rules that bring to life the vision that's in the town plan. And the town plan is supposed to be our collective vision of what we want Shelburne to be. And the rules are like, okay, and this is what it means, how you build according to that vision. So your input, your bothering to come out and show up and to tell us what you think is crucial for our being able to do that in a way that's actually reflective of what the community wants. Because otherwise we're up here, we're like, well, kind of doing sort of what we think makes sense, but that might not be enough information. So again, I thank you all for coming out and for participating, and I'm sorry it's so cumbersome and opaque. We're working on it, but yeah, it's technocratic. But it's please do know that we very much appreciate your showing up and giving us your input. And the goal is to do something that will be valuable for the community, for the people who live in the surroundings, and we want development. Maybe the best way to put it is that integrates with the best parts of what's there. So that's right now it's a highway, and then and you guys are all trying to keep it away from where you live. What if there were a way to an alternative as these areas just redevelop, to have something that blended a little better with your neighborhoods, so you wouldn't feel that you could get a stone in your eye or when you're walking, that's not, to me, what a livable town is. So that's our enterprise here is to try and improve things, and your input on how we're doing is very important. So anyway, on that note, I'll bid you all good night.
Yeah, thank you all. So now a question. We can either take this section and let this kind of ruminate a little bit, think about it within the context of these discussions we've just had, and hit it next time, or we could start going through them knowing that we're not going to get through that part tonight.
I was wondering if we could maybe tackle the buffer issue.
Yeah.
Sure.
That seemed kind of doable. Yeah.
All right.
In the memo, there was a note that said staff would have some.
Yeah. Staff had some things.
Does staff have anything to share?
Yes. I mean, I can throw up some slides. I didn't have things at hand out, but
Yeah.
With regards to
both that stuff you were just talking about and
Okay.
Buffers.
I sort of agree with letting this ruminate a little. And we could look at, because what the other piece is the drainage issue they were having, right, with the buffer.
The buffer.
And he was saying on commercial properties, the buffer was
Yes.
an issue.
Yeah, and that I know that this is all lumped together, but that one does seem a bit more straightforward, and it might be more there might be a targeted solution we could get at.
At least we knocked one out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, is that something that the slides would pertain to, or is
Yes.
that, okay. Yeah, well, let's take a look. Because the next thing was the slides on the overview to the
Well,
process.
that was really just intended to be questions and answers, because I figured you've had them for a while. I'm
Right.
not going to walk through them, but if people went through them and they had questions,
And
Pretty straightforward.
Do you have a preference? For what we
For- whichever.
I think-
Ending at 9.
yeah, right. And
That's my preference.
Brighton area.
As Gail, yes, we were both here until about 10:15 last night, so.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean,
Yeah, let's take a look at, particularly around anything with the periphery buffer.
yeah, so this is what it will
Or
all be
less.
about. I wanted to simply, okay, so, first, okay, PUD buffers to discuss in relation to this request from Automaster. Automaster has its business, it's a PUD, they want to put a structure, namely a retaining wall, in a specific location, and the answer they got was, oh, it's in the PUD buffer, you got a problem. All right, so I just thought it would be good to address first, why have buffers at all? And really, the reason why there are buffers is related to what PUDs have been designed historically to accomplish. And so in the early days of kind of modern planning, there was traditional zoning, which basically separated uses and put them on all of their own lots, rigid, the kind of stuff that Kate can shake her fist at for very good reasons. And PUDs were the kind of initial attempt to say, oh, we need a different paradigm. And so PUDs said, we're going to have a path that you can take through zoning where there's flexibility. But instead of having the cost be you build according to a specific building type or street type, you build to other requirements, and they were often environmental. And so PUDs, as Gail knows with the Natural Resources Committee, often have this intention to set aside a certain amount of open space. But historically, one of the things was a band around them, a cushion around them, so that in whatever this area where there was all these bending of rules, it was separated. So we have buffers because we have PUDs. And so second, history. Shelburne has had zoning for a long time. The zoning has contained PUD requirements for a long time, but just be aware, the PUD buffer requirements have been changed numerous times over the years. It would not be something new to change it. One of the big changes has been to make the buffer narrower. Another change has been in the mixed use district to basically try to line it up with the underlying zoning. Another thing that has happened is to say, basically, if there's a structure in the buffer already, that's not a problem. But anyway, long story short, it's been tweaked a lot. I get this third bullet in here mainly because if Jeremy Matoski was here, the engineer, he might try to take the conversation in a particular way based on his reading of this section 1980.6. The town, unfortunately, has been involved in litigation concerning the buffer. So what does the language mean? We already know what it means because a judge has agreed with us. And the takeaway from that is, let's not waste any time on 1980.6. The thing about the PUD requirements is that I gotta stop saying that word. They override the section like 1980.6. So if there's a solution, we have to find it in the PUD regs themselves.
Is it correct to say, Dean, this is a way to explain it? A PUD is like a little tiny mini zoning district just for that site?
It is in many ways effectively a rezoning for a particular parcel or property. Yes, very, very much the case. So my idea was, because in your packets, I copied the existing regs for both the form-based zoning stuff that was relevant and the PUD stuff. So you have the 1930 language. It's got several subparts. You got this introduction to PUDs, and then there are all these different flavors of PUD, depending on where you are or whether you're doing residential, commercial. The thing about the mixed-use district is back 15 or almost 20 years ago now, there was a decision made that any PUD is going to have to go through, any commercial or PUD with commercial in it was going to have to go through a specially designed set of requirements, and that's this 1930.7. So, in terms of things that you could do, as far as PUDs, you could be really, really radical, and you could change section 1930.1, where it basically sets out as policy, where it has since the beginning, you could end the policy that says the DRB can change some things, but they can't change the buffer. That's been the policy for a long time, and it's usually just meant But if the Planning Commission wanted to make PUD buffers malleable, bless you. If it wanted to make PUD buffers malleable, like the other parts of the regulations that are intended to be flexed, you could strike the phrase excluding the periphery buffer. And then that would just be the sort of thing that the DRB would address on a case-by-case basis. And it would kind of make the PUD buffer really pretty, I don't want to say irrelevant, but much more likely to be just a sort of throwaway. But that's a simple way to address this problem. It's an extreme way to address this problem, but it's something that you should know is on the table. But that isn't my recommendation. Right. My recommendation would be to do something more in line with 1930.7C, right, where there's already language that allows paths and sidewalks in the buffer. And I think you could just add retaining walls. And
I think that makes a lot of sense, because retaining walls can often enhance the ability to have paths and sidewalks.
Yes. And so I've got this on the screen because my suggestion would be to address that particular part of the regs, add language that says that retaining walls are also exempt, but the conversation, if there is one, may want to involve how landscapey the retaining wall needs to be in order to qualify. It could simply say any retaining wall. It could say stacked stone retaining wall, and the other feature could be the height. Now, if you go in the kind of landscapey route and you really do say something like stacked dry stone, there are some limits on how tall it would be, probably 4 feet. But I'm just throwing that out there, that if you like going in the direction of just adding a phrase that says retaining walls are allowable just as paths and sidewalks are, you might say retaining walls with an exposed face of up to 4, 6, or however many feet. The other thing I wanted to mention in conclusion was that the PUD requirements have been changed over time, and it's been done piecemeal. And if you do go this route of removing or adding retaining walls, then maybe also just consider throwing in the other PUD types so that the same thing is allowed, and not face a situation where, oh, well, wait, they're allowed in one PUD type, but not in other PUD types.
Is there any, when you say retaining wall, could it potentially be any height?
Well, that's what I was thinking. That would be like.
That's what I'm saying.
So you're saying, but I'm just like, if we didn't put any height requirement, could it go just to ground level? So whatever, I guess I don't know what the definition of retaining wall is if we're adding that in.
It could be
so besides height,
high.
are there?
Right.
So it could be, okay.
It could be huge. Right.
Okay. so we'd want to put in.
Yeah, so, I mean, in the maximum extreme, I would say that, if there was no number and there was just some crazy situation and someone wanted to put a wall 36 feet tall and the district says 35 feet is the maximum height, maybe there's going to be someone who's going to say, you're over the height limit by a foot. I think 35 feet of exposed wall would be kind of extreme, so I am thinking down in the below 10 neighborhood.
You know what
probably
resonates
is
with
the-
me?
You know what's gonna happen, I mean, we put 6 feet, and somebody's gonna come in at 7 or 8 as the perfect design, and that's what works best for.
Well, the point, I think one way to think about it is,
That's the danger of putting a number on it.
is a retaining wall is a technique in site design that it can enable a site to be used more efficiently and more compactly. And so to the degree that we are wanting to do that to have a more compact footprint of development, I think that might be one way to sort of, frame this.
Yeah, well, just to pick up on that, yeah, in my role as staff, I have no qualms about making this kind of change for the reasons that you say. It does have the potential for significant benefits. I think those benefits may start to get outweighed, at least from an aesthetic standpoint, if they're carried to the extreme. I guess I would disagree with you because that logic would mean no numbers ever. And there have to be boundaries, there have to be numbers. You just got to suck it up and choose a number sometimes and then take the arrows because you take the arrows.
You know when they're building the new Hannaford's in South Burlington?
Yeah.
And they leveled out the parking lot. If you come from Queen City Road,
Exactly. There's
all of a sudden there's a
There's
15-foot retaining wall there
Right.
where that didn't used to be there before. It's
Right.
very surprising.
Right.
What about if you put a caveat that if you open it up, it has benefits for stormwater management, or environmental benefits? I mean, if that's allowed,
I mean, a higher one if it's, that, I was hoping to just move the conversation along and point you in a direction. It isn't a specific proposal to warn for public hearing, but if you want to go to your next meeting with a proposal for something, we can certainly give you some edits, because I would know that, you want to do it this way.
Well, this came about because of Automaster. What do they want to do?
They want to put a retaining wall because it would be part of their stormwater system, and the location that's best suited for it is within the buffer.
And my recollection is, I think they're talking about something that would be between 3 and 4 feet tall in that location. It's pretty minimal, yeah.
and water collects now in ices, and they
Yeah.
get parks.
Yeah.
What I heard was aesthetics would be much better. It would be less costly, and it would, and result in better stormwater management, and address the issue.
BMWs don't get stuck in the ice, which is a problem.
They do now, they got stuck.
I know.
Yeah.
What you got, Gail?
I was just wondering, when we reviewed that particular project's
Last request for changes, we were very concerned about Monroe Brook. That is Monroe, right?
It is the
Yeah.
Monroe Brook Passage.
The Monroe Brook Passage. And we were very concerned at their desire to be able to extend that entire parking lot. And is this to protect the brook, or is it to, in some way, enable greater expansion for the parking lot?
So, what we heard was, so this is the part of their property that backs up to Danform Shoes. And the slope of the land is that actually it's eroding now. So I didn't get the impression that this was to be able to expand the parking lot. It was really to better manage the water in that area.
Yeah, there was no expansion of the surface or the parking
I
surface.
mean, I don't know, did anyone hear anything different?
The regulation says that parking lots are not allowed in the buffer zone. So if we allowed a retaining wall in the buffer zone, it's not like they could pave up to that new retaining wall if they're paving into the buffer zone.
But potentially making it a better area for parking could lead them to expand where they could there. I can't remember it well enough to know if there was expansion space, but it would make it.
I think what I remember is that they couldn't use
Might have them
it.
expand in a part of the site that is more suited for that would be away from the resource. So again, it increases the options for being able to, the way I see it, to use a site more efficiently. Now, we can define what we mean by efficiently any way we want, and that could be, in the interest of preserving or reducing impacts to natural resources, which I think would be very beneficial. Particularly, since this is a site in the form-based code overlay district, it would provide more detail about the intent of the redeveloped site. I mean, this is just a tweak to an existing site, but if somebody wanted to redevelop, it would, I keep looking for ways, because of our stormwater problems, to foster more efficient redevelopment that's more efficient and that's going to be more resilient and sustainable than what's currently there. So I just think that the more you can allow somebody to use the portions of the site that are suitable for redevelopment as intensively as possible, then they're not incentivized to sprawl the program, whatever their development program is, into places where we don't want to have it.
Yeah, I just had remembered a brief overview of what that application was. I wasn't able to be at the meeting where they presented it, and we had some really grave concerns because of, was it Act 250 or state stormwater regulations? I think it was state stormwater regulations, this is quite a while ago, that had recently been revised and weren't going to be revised for a while, and we were concerned about the encroachment on Monroe Brook. So if this is on the other side of the property.
So Gail, maybe I can put it in these terms. There are parts of the Automaster property under what I'll call new stormwater permits, modern ones. They're more to the south. And then there are parts of the Automaster property that are under, I'll call old or kind of archaic stormwater permits. And this design that resulted in them identifying the need for this wall is related to them planning for what they'll need to have for the replacement to the archaic permits. So in a way, I'm guessing if Jeremy was here, he'd make an argument that something like, this is part of their efforts to upgrade or do a better job managing stormwater. And of course, the state is saying that they have to, but this is what they need to do in order to have better stormwater treatment.
I would agree with that, and utilize their existing parking space, because that was kind of his thing. It's all icing up right now, and it's flooding.
Yeah. So this would allow a kind of some drainage that then could be kind of sequestered, hopefully go into the groundwater. Right now, it's just running off, and actually it's just sitting there, and it's just icing everything up. So it would allow them to use more efficiently an already existing area. And they didn't talk about how they were going to facilitate the drainage away, but it could be something like permeable paving. So it's kind of in line with what we're hoping for. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So ideally, I would love to see it replace what they just put near Monroe Brook.
Yeah.
So maybe you could make that suggestion once it's done.
If we think that the idea of a 3-foot retaining wall is appropriate, do we also need to articulate how many you can have, which is to say, if you not linear feet, but if you have one 3-foot high wall and then 2 feet back, you have another 3-foot high wall, then all of a sudden you have 6 foot feet. You know what I mean? It's like how.
So getting some narrow terracing.
Does there need to be like a 15-foot distance between every 3-foot retaining wall? I mean, I don't know what that is. I just made that up. But do you know what I mean? I mean, what does that look like? I don't know.
Yeah.
Layer cake.
Right, you could have a tiered, right, exactly.
Which could be lovely. Or not, I don't know.
I can certainly put something like that into the mix if I'm preparing materials for you. This is, at least the focus is on the Route 7 district. I'm trying to think of very many locations where there would be that much grade that someone would be really trying to build up in the width of a periphery buffer. But
at the bowling lanes.
I was just trying to think of this.
Just saying.
Well,
slopes is an issue there.
Yeah, they're not doing a PUD. And so we don't, form-based zoning doesn't have a perimeter buffer.
Oh, this is because
Right.
Automaster is operating under it.
Yeah, so
Right.
just to make it clear, this is only because it's a PUD.
Mhm.
Non-PUDs don't have this convention.
Right.
They
Okay.
would still have their setback rules, and that's.
Form-based zoning would have its setback requirements, but that are peculiar to form-based zoning and don't include the buffer. There is this requirement that would come into play between a commercial use and, I forget, protected zone, and so that keeps basically a building from shading, but, so it means a little bit larger setback, but not a buffer, like we're talking about.
Does the definition of a retaining wall have to comport with something that has a slope? Or can everybody just start to build walls in their buffer?
I didn't put together a definition of retaining wall. The phrase retaining wall is used in one other place in the zoning regs, but it isn't defined, and it's used within the phrase attractive retaining wall. I found very interesting, but I found to be justification for dwelling at least a little bit on the aesthetics. But there have been definitions of the safety fence issue that some of you remember that was added, and there was a definition of safety fence added. If you would like, if the commission wants, I can put together or find definitions of retaining walls.
My question is it a larger benefit to do it? Because it seems like in this particular case, it makes sense. And like we were just saying, it's good to raise the issue, but is changing the rules going to overall be a benefit to the town, to the other properties, or is it just solving their problem? I personally don't have enough of a sense of, like you said, like, could you build a stack of what are the potential downsides of adding it in?
That's the struggle, and I think I mentioned this last time, is that my mind tends to go towards how could this be gamed if somebody wanted to be extreme about it, or what problems are we opening ourselves up to? Because in this particular case, it makes a lot of sense.
This still has to be reviewed.
Well, it still has to be reviewed, but to some degree, that's why I'm really hesitant to say, yeah, let's just make this open to a waiver that's loose, because like in the case of Brian Precourt's sidewalk issue, if we just said, yeah, sidewalks are up to the DRB, there will always be a case, or there would often be cases to say, well, we don't think it makes sense to have a sidewalk, and you'd end up with no sidewalks. So it's...
Which is why a fund is such a great alternative.
Yeah, but I mean, to Brian's frustration, which was not thinly veiled, I get it. Like, I do get it, but there's just a lot that needs to happen that we don't have direct control over.
So go ahead. No, go ahead. Can this particular property, there's no way they can get a waiver or any, like, the only solution that they are looking for is through a rule change?
I suspect that it was something along the lines of they planned this not thinking about the need to observe the PUD buffer, and then they came in and they showed it to Revy, and Revy said, well, wait a second, you have a wall in your buffer. And they have a design. I'm not sure whether or not they would have designed it this way if they'd had a meeting with Revy before, and he said, don't forget your perimeter buffer, and they had just built it into the design. I don't know that. They don't have an alternative. I don't know that they don't want to redesign. Don't know if it's impossible.
And if it were possible, this would be a case to say, if you have a well-reasoned out reason that the DRB could accept as a waiver, great. My concern is that a waiver would just get abused. But on the flip side, if we just make that modification in 1937C, which I mean, it makes sense to me, but you're right. How could that get played out further? And I'm wondering what other language, and that's where I'm intrigued as far as how the retaining wall would get described, or if we would qualify it in some way, like in order to meet stormwater management reasons or environmental reasons, or something to qualify it that would give the DRB some guidance.
Like a point system, something.
You want a point system?
No, but something that qualifies it, gets over a threshold
Well, how about something like, and retaining walls up to 6 feet, I'm just throwing a number out there, or that, enhance stormwater mitigation.
That's a hard one to say it doesn't enhance, right?
Yeah, put some sand
Right.
behind it, and it's
Yeah.
gonna be more infiltration, and so it's mitigating stormwater. I mean, I think the idea is sound, that you wanna find some limiting measure. I'm just not sure what it would be. It may be, if you directly tied it to, the state stormwater, I don't know that there's anything in the stormwater regs that you'd say, oh, it's one of their BMPs, and maybe we need to look at the manual, and if it's done as part of one of the BMPs in the stormwater manual. Would that be a good enough justification?
That would help. I think the other thing that I'm trying to also think about what could happen if we allow this. And if somebody is really gonna game the system, push their retaining wall right up to their neighbor's property, then if it's, over 30 inches, they're gonna be required to put up a guardrail on top of that. And then that's building a structure that's not part of that. So then somebody's going to say, if you're letting us build a retaining wall, we've got to build a guardrail for it. And so you have to allow us to build a guardrail. And then it becomes this, the next thing and the next thing.
So is the buffer zone the same on every PUD? Do you see what I'm saying? So is the distance, do you know what I mean? So we were talking about the layer thing. I mean, if we're talking, what is
It
it,
would be
10
50
feet,
it would
30
be
feet?
50 feet.
50 feet.
The buffer is
So how
50
big of a cake can you build in 50 feet? Right?
You can figure you can go up at a 45-degree angle and up and over, up and over, up and over.
And one other idea that had occurred to me, I didn't put in the table, would be if you were uncomfortable with this, and it may solve their problem, I didn't check, but to say that the retaining wall basically gets to occupy half. In other words, if it's a 50-foot wide buffer, then it gets narrowed to 25 feet in instances of retaining walls. And that would somewhat reduce the height, if you're, what Stephen is saying is that you're not gonna start at the property boundary and do a series, you're gonna only get 25 feet within the buffer, and that's gonna somewhat limit it. Because remember, once they get past the buffer, we don't have any other restrictions that would prevent someone from doing that massive landfilling.
Can we say, if it's a 50-foot buffer, can we say we're going to allow one
right.
retaining wall per buffer side of 4 or 5 feet maximum height or something like that, just to keep some kind
Single
of...
level.
Come down from 6 of them.
But no, that's what I was thinking. I like that. You have
like
one
2
and it
feet.
can't, and it can't be at the boundaries.
It's like,
Yeah.
Right?
What's the limit for a guardrail? Is there
Well, if you have a drop of 30 inches, then...
30 inches?
Yeah, and it's something that somebody is walking alongside of.
Sure.
A dangerous, like a place where people are.
Okay.
If it's out in the woods, then
No.
you don't need to do anything, or in a field or whatever.
Just one
Thanks.
comment. The question is, if you do build that retaining wall and you do it at 25 feet into the 50-foot buffer, you can't use the front of that buffer that's on your side of the property to use it for other things. We were just reviewing something last night, actually, where we were concerned about what would happen because apartments wanted to be built by a buffer, in a buffer. And the apartments were very close to the buffer's edge. And so there was no backyard to the apartments. And we were concerned that people would start putting playgrounds back there. And all of a sudden, it's not a buffer anymore, or porch furniture, or things like that.
the difference, slight difference, is that was in the portion of the buffer they were using as their dedicated open space. So in their plan, that was more than the buffer, that was their designated open space. And so there's a greater conflict. Some of the buffers are more generic, not classified as open space. especially in commercial
Kind of odd
PUDs.
for them to be able to be both.
But I think it sounds like it'd be interesting to investigate new language for 1937C.
Yeah,
And-
I like that. I think it's something we should.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gail.
Thanks.
And also just to ruminate on the discussion that we heard earlier, and we can revisit. I don't know if our telecom board meeting would be the next one or the one after. I don't.
Next meeting, it would be a presentation by Brian Monahan, and I think unless something upsets the schedule, the meeting after that, so in 1 month's time, there would be the start of the hearing. I'm guessing it may go more than one night, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
I would also put, I know that you have clearly a packed schedule, but I think the sidewalk issue is something that we want to push up, because I have a fear that if we don't address it, we're going to get little patches of sidewalk all over that aren't going to get connected instead of working towards the goal of connected sidewalks. So I do think it's one that we want to push up as much as we can.
I agree, and I was, yeah, it took me a minute to reorient after Brian made his comments, but what would be the best approach to that? Because I mean, raising it at the select board meeting, and I saw some nods, and yes, like the fund, it seemed like people thought that would be good. Is that a matter of having Peter come in and just formally discussing it and saying, could we do this, and then we bake it into the regs in a way that says this is an option?
My own view, maybe a minority view, I think it's more complicated than that.
I'm sure.
I think this, yeah, I mean, you can try it. I mean, if Shelburne wants to try it, you could write the regs. If everybody likes it, it's only a problem if somebody doesn't like it and they don't want to pay the fee, and
What are the
they
odds
challenge
somebody's
it.
not gonna like something?
Can you summarize Brian's issue?
They don't get a chance, I mean, who cares if they don't like to, they have to. I mean, I was at the disappointment at the select board meeting on Tuesday was palpable with, between the pathers and the Bike and Paths Committee people and the village pedestrian people, because there's no money to do any of these improvements, and those are some very frustrated folks there. And I mean, the demand is clear. And I think, it's 2020. We cannot have some developer saying, I don't feel like, building a sidewalk. I mean, this is just unacceptable.
And that's
if
the
they're
interesting-
required to, they have to cut a check and put it in the fund.
And John, for your benefit,
Yeah,
the
fill these guys in.
so the development.
That was my first meeting.
Yeah.
I was observing when I was
The
observing, yeah.
the development project that he's doing is what, 3 houses on a
Maple Leaf, right?
3 or 4
Yes,
Three houses.
on a residential street that's within the form-based zoning overlay, and based on the rules in the form-based zone, any development you need to build a sidewalk as well. It's based on that street type.
If you take advantage of the form-based zoning, which he is.
Which he
He's putting
is.
3 houses where 2 would be allowed in normal
Is
zone.
that along Route 7?
Well, it would be like a
It's on
left
a
off of
side,
Route
it's on
7.
a side street. It's on a side street.
But it's in that area. So if you go up Route 7 and you say you take a left into this, it's the 3 or 4 houses that would be at the end of that road, and there is no current sidewalk. And based on the rules, he would have to build a sidewalk, and the neighbors have said there would just be a sidewalk in front of 4 houses and nothing else on that street, so we don't want a sidewalk.
After initially being complete, it would be a sidewalk in and of itself.
Yeah.
For that
Just in
short
front of those
distance.
houses.
Not connected.
Not connected to anything.
And logically, sure, it would look out of place, but the idea behind form-based zoning is this
Is
stuff
that
grows
over
over time.
time-
And
Right.
then the argument is, well, those other houses that don't have sidewalks in front of them, nobody's selling that anytime soon, it's not gonna happen, and you're just gonna have this out-of-place looking sidewalk. And from his perspective, he's been very clear that he doesn't care, he'll build the sidewalk, but he's coming on behalf of the residents who are asking about this. And so as a suggestion, it was, well, perhaps we could create a fund that in lieu of creating that sidewalk there, if at the discretion of the DRB it doesn't make sense, then the developer could contribute a certain amount.
You put the money in escrow or something.
Right, that would go towards like a town
Or a
sidewalk
time-
fund, because there are other sidewalks in other places. And if the rest of that street ends up being developed, then perhaps the town could use that fund to complete the sidewalks that weren't done in the first place.
So could we just write a regulation that says, upon the time when the town establishes a sidewalk fund, you may put money into it, right? You know what I mean? So you build the zoning regulation to support the future
there's the
acknowledgement that
location.
the town, the select board could on their own, and we could just leave that to them. If
That's
you guys
true.
want to create a fund, you can do it. And
See, there's
this
Shelburne.
regulation, you can use it to.
But the danger is whenever they're ready to build that sidewalk, there won't be any money in the fund, right?
For that,
Well,
purpose.
for that.
Well, for that
Right,
specific,
right.
but it's not there now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
Right.
doesn't matter.
And in that particular neighborhood, if you look, you're unlikely to have form-based zoning on a lot of them.
That's,
Right.
Triangular building?
Well, but Jean, there'll be some oversight
furniture
over that
place.
decision, because it will be reviewed by the Development Review Board, and this won't be,
Right.
done in a sort
Furniture
of cavalier,
wholesalers.
hopefully, not in a cavalier fashion.
that's the Yankee
Also, I
Doodle.
should disclose that my husband is on the village pedestrian safety, and I know I suggested the fund. Was not connecting the two in any way, but just to be completely above board.
Yeah,
There,
Right there.
Good, but no,
There's no
yeah.
sidewalks in that neighborhood at all.
conservation should be on the table.
I just worked with government for a long time, and funds are,
It gets complicated.
It's a double lot and form-based zoning with, three.
Because that's the density increase with form-based zoning.
So that's what that issue is, and I know we need to talk about the next couple of agendas, and I agree. I think that would be something good to get on there, and Neil, to your point, even if we put something together, and in a way, it would be kicking the can to the select board, which I'd rather not do, but it's progress in a way.
I think it's fine. I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of, nerves. I mean, I think that's a fine way to move it forward. I mean, we should go to them and say, here's what we're thinking of doing.
It would be a
and, you know,
combined, there's a lot going on behind
but
this, but yeah.
it doesn't put pressure on them to be like, oh, we need to coordinate, we need to do this right away. I mean, they can do it in their own
Sure.
due
I mean,
course.
but from his and from other people's point of view, it's better than not doing anything, right?
Agreed.
Right,
something together is better.
because we have had challenges, with the Development Review Board deciding that a sidewalk just didn't make sense to them in a certain area, and they decided they had the discretion to not allow it. And so we lost all of that. We didn't even get, the amount that it would have cost to put in a sidewalk that could have been used elsewhere where we desperately need them.
And I do definitely want to be mindful of time, so I think as far as these discussions go, I think we've got some stuff in terms of juggling future agendas. There's been some great discussion tonight. Moving into other business, did you have anything?
Well, I was gonna hand out the legal opinion and the applications, and I didn't know if you wanted to mention anything. We had, Lee's request or indication that Bobby Miller is still interested in his idea. And
Yes.
You had said maybe that would come up under other business.
Yeah, I had
And
a couple of things actually.
Maybe while you're doing that, I'll start.
Okay, so you can hand that out. Yeah, the Bobby Miller request was to add just to refresh memories, was to add a conditional use to the lot that's on the north side of the Teddy Bear Big Green Building.
the parking of.
To enable that to be a car storage lot. And initially, I have hesitation around that until we've allowed the economic development process to come along a little bit. Primarily, thank you. That's a lot. Primarily because there's already commercial use there that draws customers to businesses, and I think that looking through the lens of an economic development perspective, a parking lot may not be the best use of that space, or a car storage lot may not be the best use.
Which lot is that, sorry?
It's to the north side of the big green building on the Teddy Bear property, their factory.
Okay.
And it's right up against the property line of the Artisan Village.
Right.
So if there's ever any connection that wanted to occur between the Teddy Bear and that, this would be like in the way, and it would be a car storage lot for one of the dealers, yeah. Yep.
So, Dean, there had been some discussion about creating just such a path as Stephen was describing between the two PUDs. And as I remember, Act 250 was an obstacle because
I'm not sure.
There
Act 250, there is a study that came up with a preferred design. There is a possible connection. corridor. The total project is pretty expensive. I forget how many hundreds of thousands. It's over $1 million. The cost had people discussing what was the most priority location, and the place they were focusing on was improving the connection further north. So it's, I think, not something that the group doesn't want to see, the PAS committee doesn't want to see. It's just that they're already pushing for the Irish Hill project, and if the money is, going to be hard to raise, I know people have said, well, maybe Teddy Bear would provide some amount of money. I'm not sure. I think they might be more likely to do the easement.
But what about a roadway?
A roadway?
Yeah. Like, to make a loop in and out of, like, in Teddy Bear and out to Artisan Village and vice versa, instead of, like a horseshoe, instead of just two roads that end and then maybe a little path.
I think that you've got to deal with some
I mean, aren't we trying to get,
physical features.
through form-based zoning, trying to get alternate around connections?
We are,
but that's not the form-based district.
I know, but
With the idea, yes.
wouldn't we still want to
And the
promote that?
connectivity is big. Yeah.
Yeah, so, the study that was done wasn't a road study, it was a bike ped study, so it was looking for a way to make it, to improve bike ped mobility coming down through this area and getting across to Teddy Bear. And then coming in and having it be possible to go down to Route 7 and then come down and then go up into Ridgefield. So those are the different segments. This is the third phase, this is the second phase, and the first phase is this northern portion. So the idea of a road connection, Stevens mentioned, that may be where people are thinking of Act 250 stuff. This is an area that is part of their Act 250 approval. I believe they had to basically lock in the ag soils. So I don't think that there's going to be a road across this. If that.
What about a path? Would that be an
Well, I think
obstacle to a path?
I think a path's going to be okay to find some way around it, but I'm not sure that a road would be. And I just don't know that anybody's ever really seriously studied a road.
And where the mouse is right now is that space that they were considering, or that they would like to see a car lot.
Oh, so here.
So how's he gonna get the cars there?
It would come through the Teddy Bear Drive, yeah, and it would be about 4 car carriers a week, I believe they said. But fundamentally, it would require a change to add a conditional use to enable that as a use. And I would like the opinion of the board. I would just say my initial hesitation had to do with, we have this economic development initiative that's happening. I would like to think that there might be opportunities to connect some of the retail options around there, because it's already a draw in a way.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's a definitive thing. I would just like to let that process play out a little bit. There had been some follow-up requests about where we are in this process, and so I'm open to the discussion if we wanted to talk about entertaining a conditional use for that, if anybody has thoughts.
Well, my thought is that if we're going to entertain a conditional use for a specific use, I think we would want to choose a use that would be of great benefit to that area. And in my opinion, a car storage lot would be about on the lowest level scale of being a great benefit to that area out there. But I agree with what you're saying, that if there's anything that should be promoted as the kind of extension of the Teddy Bear kind of artisanal village that's going on.
Yeah. But the Teddy Bear factory is, I believe, considered the third top tourism draw in the state. And I would think Artisan Village, the adjacency of Artisan Village next to it is incredible. So a way that would meaningfully connect those two properties, I think we would be squandering a tremendous opportunity to enhance economic development. I think there would be quite diminished returns from this kind, allowing this as a conditional use, particularly in that setting.
And also, I apologize, with respect to the time, I mostly was bringing this up in terms of would we want, I mean, is it important enough to want to put that kind of discussion on a near-term agenda, or are we comfortable saying we would like to see some input from an economic development initiative, or have some other discussion? We're not inclined to do that at this time, mostly as a way of just getting feedback to that process.
Maybe I'm a little sensitive to how Brian responded, but I feel like, you know, we have a responsibility to get back to people.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Like, either we put a discussion to actually entertain a conditional use, or we say we're going to wait on the economic development.
I would say yes. I would say yes.
To which one?
To, yes, put it on the agenda, and let's.
I don't know how we balance that with everything else that's on.
Well, which is
the agenda.
true. I mean, then it just
feels like it's a lower priority.
It's certainly,
than other things.
but that could be a report that we get back that it's in the queue, and then I would add that, you know, some input from the other process would be beneficial, but it's not a priority.
Because if we also wait for that development to happen, that village to expand, that could take decades, right? That they may not be, I mean, so the person who owns that land may find a better, you know, some use for it at least. It may not be what we want, but that's not.
Well, we have enough to provide some feedback. It's not a burning issue right now.
Right.
For this commission.
I would be saying wait for more information, because just personally, I agree that a car storage lot isn't necessarily the kind of thing we want going up all over that area. Because again, if we change the rules, it can go other places as well. And that seems like it could be very detrimental to have lots of car storage lots going up. So it's not something that we'd want to do in a rush.
So right now, Dean, what kind of expansion on that lot is possible?
Well,
what are the alternatives?
That was the premise of their presentation, was that it was, if I remember correctly, the premise was that was supposed to be another building.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it would be if you think of this as building 1, building 2, and then another, it's segmented. So yes, there was, so there's a phase of this that is basically underneath this cursor. So take one of these and turn it sideways and run it along the north. That's what is shown on a plan that's been seen before. And so I think, yes, they're saying it's already approved for a building, well, kind of, sort of, so put a parking lot instead.
Manufacturing.
Yeah, right now they cannot build a storage lot without a conditional use. So it becomes a matter of, would we have the discussion, or are we waiting for additional input? I was leaning toward the latter, because there are initiatives that would give us more insight to what might be possible. If we're okay with that, that can just be the message that is given back. And it sounds like
Silly, or maybe it's down, but what additional input?
the economic development initiative that would actually be reaching out to what businesses might use the existing uses, or what might be possible, because there's been discussion around that area. I mean, there's businesses in and out there.
Is there a time limit on that? I mean,
from their perspective, they would like to start construction in the spring.
No, but the feedback from potential interest.
That's kind of in the select board's court.
And that's why I say I'm looking for input from economic development, for the same reason that when we're talking about form-based zoning and we talk about like that Martindale thing, and everybody talks about the liquor store and there's a boat shop there, but what do those owners, I mean, would those owners ever entertain selling or becoming something different? Like, there's all kinds of discussion that should happen around that, I think, before decisions get made.
But what's the best case scenario if an economic development study was done and to say it was going to add $5,000 to the tax rolls of Shelburne? Would we say, okay, let's go build a parking lot? Or would we say, you know, we don't want the parking lot anyway? And like, we just went through all this, you know, waiting of time to say the same result. I mean, to go, like you're saying, Stephen, go back to what Brian was saying, you know, like, can you give me an answer? Like, either way, I just want an answer.
And this is what I'm saying. Do we want to, I mean, let's just say this. We're going to slot this into a future meeting. I couldn't tell you exactly when that is. And we're going to discuss and vote as a board whether or not we would like to entertain a conditional use for that. I don't have a timeline for it. And then that's something that we can let them know that it's in the queue. And before we adjourn, I did just want to mention on the budget issues, I wasn't able to make it to the select board meeting, but I did notice, and I'll get the numbers wrong, one thing that I'll find some way of providing this input, that there was a line for municipal building energy efficiency improvements. I believe it was a $20,000 item that got cut in half, which my opinion there, or the feedback I would like to give, I don't know if the rest of the commission feels the same, is that those types of projects tend to have quick ROIs, pay for themselves, and it's recurring savings. So I would prefer to promote that over something that may not necessarily have the same kind of ROI. Not to say they would agree with that, but just to put that out there. And the other thing was,
That makes sense.
That's the math.
okay, straw poll. And the other one was the open space fund, I believe, effectively got axed altogether, right? Is that?
Well,
Or
that's coming back. It
is.
It was like this weird 32.5 compromise figure. It was
Okay.
something,
Yeah.
there was a question of, was it 30, was it 35? And then they said, well, 32.5.
Yeah, but it sounds, Colleen wasn't there, but it sounds
Right, Colleen.
generally like it would just be going too far in the direction of, anathema to not have it at all. So they were going to have, they were trying to figure out maybe could they level fund it or do at least 30,000.
And so, right, some of the issue was.
Weird 32.5 thing got thrown out.
Well, so some of the issue was they said level fund, and last year was 35, but they were acting like it was 30, and so the conversation about level funding was hinging on 30, but then it was like, well, no, it was really 35, well, I'm not comfortable 35, so the compromise was 32.5.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was mostly just saying that as just awareness, because that process is going on, and whatever conversations we may be having, those inputs are always good for people to get. Is there anything else given the hour? Because I would take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Kate, seconded by Neil. All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tim.